Tell me if this sounds familiar. You wake up and think to yourself, today is the day I'm going to sit down and paint and draw. So you get up, get dressed, you go to work, you work all day, and then you get home and you are exhausted. So you decide to take a little break, maybe have a snack, hang out on the couch, watch some TV, have dinner, and as the night rolls on, that itch is still there in the back of your mind saying, hey, we were gonna sketch today, we were gonna paint today. And you know you want to, but you're exhausted and you're not really sure what you want to do. So I'll tell you how I get through this. If you are in that mindset of knowing you want to create something but not really sure what, and maybe you're too exhausted to spend too much time coming up with some amazing concept, that's okay. What we need to do is eliminate our choices. Give ourselves some kind of easy start. And for me, a lot of times that just means I open up some kind of stock website like Pixelbay or Unsplash, and I will type in a random landscape idea like coastal. The first 10 images are the only ones I'm allowed to choose from. So I'll scroll through those images and pick my favorite. And then comes the pencil. And this is just a quick study. Honestly, it's just something to get myself warmed up. It gets my eyes and my hand on the same page, and it gets my mind starting to think about the landscape. So it usually turns out to be just a very loose, basic value study of whatever it is I'm painting. In this case, I'm using my reference photo as pretty loose inspiration, mostly about the colors and the texture. So instead of copying exactly what I see, I'm using a little creativity and maybe changing up the composition or adding or subtracting different elements. And as I'm selecting my colors, I'm starting to think about which layers I'm going to start with and all of the different steps of the painting. And sometimes I can get lost in my thought and I'll just start fiddling around with my colors for a good 5 minutes, but it's just part of my process. It's a good idea to have a plan of action when you go into the actual painting. And a lot of times, if I'm not quite sure what I want to do, I just default to a very transparent, thin first layer. When I started this painting, I had a pretty good idea of how I wanted to execute it. So that was basically with a thin layer at first, and then I would come back in, add some salt for texture here and there, and then start building up my opacity as I went closer to the foreground, which will be a lot of little grasses. And as part of my design of the composition, I thought it would be kind of cool to have lots of the elements leaning from the top left down to the bottom right of the painting, so a slight diagonal orientation of the landscape. And then later I would come back in with a cloud form of some kind and use that in the opposite direction. So do like an opposite diagonal. You'll see what I mean later. But I'm thinking about these things as I go through the painting, getting ideas for how I can improve it. And a lot of times you are just reacting to the decisions you make in the moment. Now, with most gouache paintings, you want to start with the furthest elements and work your way forward. So in this case, I'm putting in those really dark trees that you see in the distance. And one thing that I'm keeping in mind is that if I want this scene to look like a bright sunny day on the coast, I need to add contrast. I need to have enough contrast in the painting so that it looks like the sun is bright and there are dark shadows. And that means I need to place my darker shadows flowing across the landscape pretty early on in the painting, because that's what we're going to build up the texture and the bright grasses on top of later. So I make that transition from those dark trees in the distance and start thinking about just the shadows in the landscape, working my way in that diagonal format that I talked about earlier, and just spreading those lines thinly across the page, making sure that I let some of that bright sand peek through here and there. And I haven't removed the salt yet because I still want that salt texture to affect this shadow layer. because one thing I love about salt is that it gives such a beautiful variety of surface texture on the paper and in the paint that it really it lends itself well to creating ground cover or sandy areas, and I mean all sorts of things, but especially I love it for coastal scenes. And now that my sky is dry, I can come back in and start laying in some of the more prominent cloud forms. And I'm using a dry brush so that it doesn't start blending in too much with the background. I want it to stand out. I'm also going in the opposite direction of the first layer of the sky because I wanted to have that contrast. Once all of my foreground areas are dry, I can come back in and start doing the grasses. And I honestly love laying in clusters of grasses like this. It's so fun and therapeutic in a way because it's just a very repetitive motion. It might sound boring, but this is a really small painting, first of all, so it's not going to take too long. And second of all, because it's pretty repetitive, I can kind of let my mind wander either about other areas of the painting or other projects that I'm doing. And in a weird way, it's almost like how people feel when they're doing a coloring book. So yes, it takes some thought while I'm doing it, but a lot of times I can just kind of let my mind wander and it's very relaxing to me. One thing that's really going to help give this scene that sense of bright sunniness is not only the contrast, but also the color choices. So I'm going with the classic idea of using cool shadows and warm highlights. And in a small space like this, you can only do so much detail, but using color wisely like that can do so much for your scene. One little trick I have for doing these grasses with gouache is that you have to have get that delicate balance of a wet brush with enough pigment on it. If you go too wet, your pigment is going to be translucent and it's not going to show up as that bright grass that it should be. So you have to get it wet in order to make sure it doesn't clog up, but then you have to clean it off and reload the brush pretty much after a couple seconds of brush strokes. So you can't go too far before reloading your brush. In this painting, I'm using the idea of silhouette to indicate the brightness of the sun. So in the background, you can see I did a dark line of trees, and then I did a bright section of grass in front of that. So that indicates that the sun is pouring through those clusters of grasses, and they're casting those long dark shadows across the sand. And in order to emphasize that, I don't just want to keep doing bright clusters of grasses in the foreground. I actually need to do the opposite in the foreground. So I'll be creating these really tall brushstrokes of darkness, and then later coming back in and adding a bit of highlight to them. And you can almost think about it like you're sandwiching those bright grasses in the middle of the painting between your dark sections. And this concept can work for so many different things in a landscape, like rocks and forests and all sorts of stuff. And if it were an overcast day, it would be a very different strategy. You wouldn't have those long lines of shadow, and your coloring and your strategy for lighting would be very, very different. So this is a technique that works for bright, sunny things, and maybe not necessarily good for other things. If you need help figuring that out, one thing that you can do is study your reference photo not only for the forms, but also how the colors are appearing in the landscape. And you can also look at like master painters and what they do. That's something that I've done in the past and I learned so much. So look at how they used color to represent different types of objects in different types of scenes. A lot of people are at home because we are all in self-isolation because of the COVID thing, but not everyone feels like they know how to translate their motivation or their desire to paint into actually doing the thing. So that's why I wanted to post this video and show you guys how I get through it and just kind of talk about it casually. And if you struggle with this, please know that you are perfectly normal. All artists go through it at some point, and it's especially hard when you are more stressed out and more tired, no matter what the reason is. I just find for myself that a lot of times when I'm in maybe a more high stress mode, instead of forcing myself to try to be creative, I go into more of a production mode. And by that I mean, instead of sitting down and forcing myself to think of awesome creative concepts, I will just either do studies, or I'll work on color theory, or just something where I'm still being productive and learning, but it's not as much of a creative burden. So if any of you guys have experience with this, if you have advice for how you get through it, please drop it in the comments below. I feel like we can all learn from each other and get through this together. A lot of people are saying, oh, we should be using this time of self-isolation to better ourselves, but sometimes that's just not possible. If we are using all of our emotional and mental energy just being able to cope with what's going on, sometimes we are left with very little room for creativity and very little energy for anything else. So yeah, I just wanted to give a little pep talk and let you guys know that it's all okay. We'll get through it together, and hopefully my videos will help inspire or, lead you in the right direction. Feel free to leave comments, chat with each other, send me messages, the usual. So stay inspired, guys, and I will talk to you again soon.